Hello and welcome to today's video. So this time I'm delighted to be able to join my friend Steve Holland, who's just released a fantastic new book, The Trials of Hank Janson. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Jules.
So, Steve, well, thank you for sending me a copy of the book. And I reckon I'm almost a quarter of the way through now. And it's getting to the juicy bits where they're starting to... the censorship is starting to creep in, and he's getting a little bit worried. So, I mean, it's a fascinating story. But first of all, before we get into this, tell us a little bit about yourself, Steve.
Well, I worked as a magazine editor for quite a few years, and I've always been interested in the history of comics and the history of books. So I started writing about them back in the 1980s. I did a book called Vultures of the Void with a chap called Phil Harbottle, and we did a second book that they actually took a long time to come out. They were sold to Borgo Press and then took years before they could come out. In the meantime, I wrote The Mushroom Jungle, which was a history of 1950s. Yeah. Yes, it's a book that desperately needs to be updated. Over the last 20, 30 years since it came out, I've learned an awful lot more. So that's something that I'll work on in the future. But yeah, The Mushroom Jungle came out in I think the early 90s, 92, something like that, 94. At that time, I was editing magazines for a company called Aceville. I worked for them for many years, on and off. I had an idea to publish some comics, to do some comic reprints in about 2009. And I experimented a lot with a print on demand. And at that time, we ran into a couple of problems. One was the people that we wanted to license the material from. I thought we had a good deal, and then they turned around and said, well, can you look at the print runs and can you look at the cover price again? And I was thinking, well, no, I've looked at that and I think this is what the market can stand. So unfortunately, that coincided with a move. We moved house, and it took a couple of years to settle down, get things back on an even keel and sort it out. And in 2011, I launched Bear Alley Books, to publish my comic indexes, and since then I've done about 40 books, but not just comic indexes. I've done some comic reprints. I've done some novels that were out of copyright, some out of copyright novels I've reprinted, various collections and bits and bobs, and just recently The Trials of Hank Janson.
Indeed. And this one itself was originally, 20 years ago, published by Telos?
It was, yes. Yeah. I was working with Telos. They had acquired the copyright for Hank Janson, and I was working with them writing introductions to each of the books, which lasted a couple of years. They did reasonably well, enough to keep them going for a few years. And I suggested that I write a book about Hank Janson, which I had touched on before. I had written it was more of a pamphlet about Hank Janson called The Trials of Hank Janson. And again, I knew I could greatly expand on it. And there was so much fascinating history to delve into that it would require a full-length book. So I'm very lucky that Stephen James Walker and David Howe said yes.
Stephen Francis, I never really knew a lot about this chap at all. In fact, I never knew anything about it. Just up to where I am so far, I thought his original sort of history, he was a conscientious objector, wasn't he, during the Second World War?
Yes.
But clearly, I made a little note, clearly an intelligent chap, and very, very hardworking from what I can see. Like, I guess, he wanted to earn a crust, but then I'm just, we're aware, as book collectors, we're aware of the shortages of paper and stuff after the war. And that was the era where he was able to really thrive, wasn't he? With pumping out the early novels.
Yes. Yes.
And
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned you're about a quarter of the way through and things are just livening up. But I did feel that I had to front load the book in a way with information about Stephen Francis to explain it. I mean, he grew up in grinding poverty. His father died a year after he was born in the First World War. So Stephen had barely met his father. And this helped explain why he explored various political avenues. He was a member of the Young Labour Party and things like that. Also a member of the Communist Party.
The Communist Party, and the Socialist League.
And this helped explain the political agenda of his whole life. He had just had this horror of bureaucracy, authority grinding people down, and of course that is exactly what happened to him. He always argued that the golden goose was Hank Janson. I mean, that was where and how he made his money, and the business was utterly destroyed by authority that he thought, well, two things: one, the books were not obscene, which they were charged with, and two, it was just the way that they were made guilty and not found guilty.
Indeed, in fact, they couldn't even define what is obscene. There was no right or wrong answer, was there? So the books, those very early books that he got published, they had, well, the initial ones were quite low print ones, like 20,000, slowly run to 25, then 30. Are those super difficult to find today, those early ones?
The very first two that were published by, he set up a company called Pendulum Publishing, but there was a second company called Ward and Hitchin, which was used to apply for more paper. It's basically, a lot of these companies had 2 or 3 different imprints that they used, and it was all about finding paper. So the first Hank Jansons were published by Ward and Hitchin, and they had print runs. The very first one had a print run of 20,000, and it came to be written because a printer contacted Steve and said, "We've got enough paper for a 24-page book, 20,000 print run. What have you got?" And he said, "I'll look. I'll see what we've got." I couldn't get any of his regular writers to knock something out because the printers needed it by Monday. So he went to his secretary and said, "Look, do you want to, sort of like work over the weekend? Do you mind?" She said yes, and he again, a distributor. He spoke to the distributor, said, "Well, I've got 20,000 books. What should I print?" And they said, "Well, look, westerns. There's too many westerns on the market. Try crime. Try gangster." And that's how Hank Janson came around. Steve dictating to his secretary over the weekend until he had enough words to fill the pages that he had available to him.
And then, repeat the process as pretty much as often as he could, I see. And another fortuitous moment when he met Reginald Heed to do some of the covers.
Yeah.
I mean, wow.
Yeah. Heed had been producing hard jacket covers for many years for all of the major publishers. And after the war, of course, the paper shortage meant that there were fewer books being published in smaller numbers. The wartime conservation, what was it? The wartime, basically they printed books thinner and often without dust jackets.
Just like paper rationing,
Exactly, yes. So that caused a problem for a lot of book cover artists. And then there was this thriving cheap paperback market, and a number of them, including Heed, including McConnell, stepped into it with gusto. And produced some, they were the fantastic cover artists, and
absolutely.
Even there were other cover artists like Peff, started in that cheap paperback market as well, working for Milestone, I think his earliest covers were for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. It's difficult to sort of picture a time, which is what, almost 75 years ago now, where anything that was printed was just pounced on because it was just such a big shortage of reading. And like you say, the publishers were struggling. Post-war, they had a certain paper allowance that they had to adhere to. And if you were a startup publisher, it was going to be really difficult, wasn't it, to get going?
I think you were limited to a ton of paper, and I can't remember whether that was a quarterly or annually. But a number of little publishers would publish short story collections and tried little magazines that they could publish quarterly. But they were slowly taken over by slightly longer novels that could be printed and charged less. You could get a 128 page, 136 page full length, and I should do full length like that. Because they were around 40,000 words. But you could print a full-length novel and charge 1 and 6, rather than a 64-pager that you were charging 6 pence for. So, it was economies of scale and greed.
Absolutely. So, as I said, the point that I've got up to last night was the head of censorship was sort of it's like the early 1950s, and the books were starting to be like looked at as, well, this is is this obscene? Is it not? And starting to affect the business. And that's about as far as I've got in the story. So what happens next? Or do you want to give it away? Not too much.
No. I don't think it's that much of a mystery. The book's been out for 20 years. Perhaps I should explain how the destruction orders worked. Because a lot of people still think that if a book is charged with being obscene, then you get a big show trial at the Old Bailey, and you can argue your case. Well, that's not how most of it works. What actually works is that somebody complains about a book in a shop, usually a newsagent's. And the police say, okay, well, we'll go in and we'll send somebody in. And it's usually a younger officer, or a cadet. So they send in a cadet or a young officer to go in and buy something that they think is hot. So they come out and it's immediately handed over to the chief constable, who has a look at it and says, oh, this is a bit risky, something like. He can then apply to a magistrate and says, look, there are these dirty books in this shop. We want to go in and raid it. So the police would descend on a newsagent and basically hoover up everything. Anything that had a sexy cover, and a lot of these gangster novels did, they would literally just grab everything. The magistrate would then issue a destruction order, which meant that they would tell the newsagent, you have an opportunity to argue your case in court, or we will issue this destruction order. So it was found guilty until proven innocent, rather than the other way around. Unfortunately, in a majority of cases, when faced with the law and authority and somebody saying, look, you're going to have to defend these in court, most newsagents just turned around and said, okay, well, it's £10 worth of books. Destroy them as you will. One or two contacted the publishers and said, well, how do we defend these books? So some publishers did defend the books, and often successfully. I mean, when faced with a court case, most of the newsagents just said, no, destroy the books. But of course, that meant that thousands of books were being destroyed in a short period of time. This all started around 1950. And the DPP put together a list of books that had been successfully destroyed. But let's not forget that the majority of those books had not actually been to trial. They were destroyed just because nobody wanted to defend them. But it also meant strange things, like the children's newspaper. There's an issue of the children's newspaper that was destroyed for being obscene. And you could not get anything more innocent than the children's newspaper.
It just got
It was
sort of tarred with the same brush almost. Yeah.
It got hoovered up somehow in a raid and was destroyed.
Right.
Hank Janson was picked up a couple of times and taken to court up in, I think, Blackburn and Darwin, the two cases that then led up to the bigger trial at the Old Bailey. So this is what happens next, is that they, I think Stephen Francis would argue, and I've kind of argued as well, that they needed a show trial, and the Recorder of London decided that Hank Janson was going to be that show trial. He would take that trial himself, which was unusual. He would sit in judgment, and he certainly did. He had prejudged those books, and I think that comes out in the Trials of Hank Janson, how he had prejudged that book. Any further than that, I think you need to read the book and find out.
Absolutely. Well, I can't wait to finish it. Now that I'm into it, I cannot wait to finish it. So, okay, no, fascinating stuff. Now, Steve, what about your own collection? So Hank Janson's been, a focus of, a couple of books now. So, do you have many yourself? Do you have a bit of a Hank Janson library?
I've got one of every of the early books. I have not got a complete set. A lot of the later books, I'm interested them in passing, but my prime focus was always on the early ones, and also my prime focus was on getting copies of each one. So I don't necessarily have them all with the Heed covers.
Right. Some were reprinted, weren't they?
They were often reprinted. Yeah, I mean the print runs were enormous, and the early books, the print runs were rather low, so the early ones were reprinted quite often. So you can find copies that have like 12th edition. Whether it was the 12th edition or not, I don't know.
They would just make it up sometimes.
Yeah, 8th edition, 5th edition, whatever. What looked good on the cover, but they were often reprinted without the sexy covers. Certainly there was that period when books were being picked up constantly. So so yes, I do have all of them. Some as reprints, some as with the original Heed covers. The very first one that I bought was Whiplash, which has a particularly, I think, it's one of the best covers. And that really turned me into a sort of Hank Janson reader. And I bought a couple more and worked my way through those as well, and just became a big fan of the writing.
I've got a couple of odd ones in my collection that I sort of picked up in the 80s and 90s when I was just starting to collect books, but I've never actually read them. And I sort of remember, if I understand it, we had the nice sort of digesty size Heed covers first. Then they went a little bit more uniform. Was that late 50s, early 60s, was it?
Yeah.
Sort of seeing almost like rows of them at the London paper. Much more plentiful back then, I think.
Yes, certainly. I mean, they were still being published up until, I think, 1971.
Right. So those would be the compact ones, would it?
That would be the compact, yeah. What happened was the big trial in 1954 led to the publisher being jailed and the distributor too. But it also drove New Fiction Press, who were the publishers, that drove them out of business. Reg Carter, who was the man behind New Fiction Press, set himself up again in 1955 as Alexander Morring. He basically bought a defunct company. Right. Alexander Morring then published Hank Janson. What they did is they printed the books in France for a while, just to make sure that they could continue publishing, because they thought, well, if customs lets them through, they must be okay. And they had less sexy covers. Yeah, not beat around the bush. The covers were not so good. He did one or two, but a lot of them were adapted from Heed paintings, and they had another artist who was not quite exquisite as Heed's artwork was. So that carried on for a few years. Reg Carter got diversified into various businesses, a lot of which failed. Unfortunately, what he should have done was concentrate on the Golden Goose, which was Hank Janson, which was generating a lot of money still.
Yeah.
Sales went up from like 5 million to 8 million during those Mooring years. Wow. So, that was a good large profit for any publisher. Yeah. Unfortunately, Steve Francis was by then living over in Spain and was not seeing any of the benefits of this money coming to him, because the money was being fed back into the business, into the printing, into sort of like raising the number of copies printed, and he was unaware that the money was also going into other businesses. Right. But then, so Reg Carter eventually sold his. He owned Hank Janson by then. He sold Hank Janson to a guy called Jim Roberts. Roberts and Vinter were then bought out by the Gold brothers, and that was Compact Books, which is the publisher that most people remember as being the Hank Janson publisher.
Yeah. And they seem having a quick look on eBay, those do seem quite plentiful. The compact ones. Yeah, brilliant. Oh well, there we are. So, fantastic stuff. It is a fascinating story, and I think anyone with an interest in vintage paperbacks and publishing history is going to really sort of enjoy this one. I mean, the only sort of previous censorship trial I've ever read was the Lady Chatterley one for Penguin, which has been quite well documented. So this is interesting to see it from another side, really.
Without Hank Janson, there would have been no Lady Chatterley, because Hank Janson. The fuss around the trial of Hank Janson meant that so many books were being picked up that they were gathering up classics that had been available for hundreds of years. And it was that the DPP, the Department of Public Prosecution, they suddenly thought, hang on, this is ludicrous. So like, we're going to be picking up all these classic novels, and we're going to be the laughing stock. So they were trying to work out how they could issue information to the chief constables of the area. And this was something that they actually denied that they ever did. But they had a secret list of all the books that had been destroyed, and they were also planning to contact publishers. They created a list, or they were working on a list of books that shouldn't be destroyed. So they were effectively acting as censors, which they eventually said, well, no, we shouldn't do that, even though that technically they were already doing that. But yes, so the MPs got involved and set up a big, and then a bill went through, which was Roy Jenkins put in a bill to change the Obscene Publications Act, and that was discussed and then passed into law in 1959. But without the Hank Janson trial, that would not have occurred. So there is a chance. But what happened is that the new Obscene Publications Act allowed you to bring in people and explain what the artistic quality of the book was, which had not been tried before.
And that's what Penguin.
And that is what allowed. That is what allowed Lady Chatterley to be published. So without Hank Janson, I'm not saying that it wouldn't have happened eventually, because if it wasn't Hank Janson, it would have been somebody else. It would have been Hubert Selby. It would have been one of those kind of books. There'd have been a change eventually, but it occurred that early in the 1950s, and there is a through line from Hank Janson to Lady Chatterley.
Fantastic, excellent. What an interesting slice of paperback history, and I think viewers of this channel, they very much should go and grab a copy. So, where's the best way to get one of these? Then is it direct from yourself, Steve, or from the publisher, or?
Well, you can. I'm a one-man band, so the best way is to actually contact me. My Bear Alley Books page is online. Just look up Bear Alley Books. There are links in there.
Links below.
There are links in there to Amazon. You should be able to buy it from around the world in Amazon. The only thing that you might not be able to find in all territories is the hardback. Some countries don't publish the hardback, which I mean, I kind of do recommend it. It's a lovely volume in hardcovers.
Oh yes, indeed, yeah.
So, but yes, or you can order directly through me. Just do a search for Bear Alley Books, and I'm happy to sign copies. So I brought in a limited number of the hardbacks, half of which have already gone. But I've got plenty of the paperbacks, and you know, I'm happy to sign them to somebody. I'm happy to just sign them so that you can flog it on eBay in a couple of years' time.
We don't mind. Yeah.
It's going to happen.
Yeah. No worries. Well, all those links I shall pop in the description below. But well, thanks for joining us, Steve. It's a fascinating book, a great, interesting subject, and well, I hope it sells loads of copies. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been great to speak to you today, Steve. And
it's been a pleasure.
Super stuff.
I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And if you've enjoyed it at home, do please give the video a thumbs up. Do please hit the subscribe button if you've not already for regular vintage paperback content. And I shall look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye.